Yo guys, back with another video for F122, and I've recently released the wet setup for Portugal. So now that we have a wet setup for every single track in F122, I thought I'd collate them all together in a place where you guys can reference and just visit one video rather than seeking out different videos. So in this video you're going to see every single wet setup in F122. Please smash that like button if you enjoy this video, and subscribe as well, because over 70% of you guys who watch this haven't actually subscribed to my channel yet. So hit that subscribe button and also the alert bell if you want to be notified when I drop new F122 and other sim racing content. So I'm going to kick things off with the most unlikely of scenarios, a wet race setup for Bahrain. Now you guys will probably never need this setup in career mode, but well, here it is anyway. Kicking things off, we've gone with a front wing aero of 18 and a rear wing aero of 24. You'll see through a lot of these setups that the aero is going to be much higher than in the dry setups, and that's just because you need more downforce in the rain. And all of these wet setups in this series are created for the very wet race condition, so as wet and rainy as you can get with the full wet tyres. If you're using intermediates, you're going to have to create a hybrid car setup between this and the dry setup. But back to this Bahrain setup first. Moving on to the transmission, I've gone 50% on the on and off throttle diff. This will be the norm with most of these setups. Some setups might use sort of 50 to 60% on throttle, but for Bahrain I've gone right down to 50% to help with traction out of the slower corners. Then for the suspension geometry, I've gone right, left. Again, this is kind of the norm now with F122 setups. It was the same with previous games as well. In the rain, you don't need to worry as much about keeping your tyre temperatures down as you do in the dry, so you can run more aggressive suspension geometry and tyre pressures. If anything, you'll struggle to get heat into your tyres in the rain. Then looking at the suspension setup itself, I've gone 3 on the front suspension, 1 on the rear, and then 4 on the front anti-roll bar and 1 on the rear again. So I've softened things down a lot just to make the car a little bit more easy to drive. And then for the ride height, I've gone 6 at the front and 5 at the rear. Again, this is higher than it is in our dry setup to avoid any aquaplaning. And for the brake setups, I finally used something different other than 100% pressure and 50% brake bias. I've lowered the pressure all the way down to 94%. What this will do is essentially it will make your brakes easier to manage during a race. You won't lock up as easily. So with this setup, you can apply full brake pressure for a little bit before you have to start lifting off as you approach the corner apex. And then for the tyre pressures, I've actually gone pretty high here. Go 24.8 on both fronts and 22.3 on both rears. In previous F1 games, it was beneficial to drop your tyre pressures down in the rain, which would in theory create a larger contact patch with the road, increasing traction. But if you do that in F122, your tyre temperatures are going to plummet through the floor, and you're going to really struggle to get any heat into your tyres and any grip really. So I've gone pretty aggressive here, and this will probably be the norm throughout these wet setups. Remember, if you're racing in intermediate conditions and not the full wet heavy rain condition, you may need to lower these a little bit closer to how they are in the dry setup. And that will go and do it for our first wet race setup of F122. Here's our wet setup for Jeddah, another unlikely scenario, very similar to Bahrain, but here we go anyway. So kicking things off, I've gone 25 on the front wing, 32 on the rear. Again, this is higher than our dry setup for more aero. Again, a little bit more focus on the rear as well, because the rear will be the part of the car which will really kind of slip and slide out of corners. Transmission, 50%. This will be pretty much the norm across most tracks. Suspension geometry, I've gone -2.7 and then -1.3 on the camber, and then far left on the front and rear toe. Setting the toe to minimum and camber close to maximum will really just help you get grip out of the corners, which is where you're really going to struggle in the rain. Suspension, I've gone 3 on the front suspension and 3 on the front anti-roll bar, and then 1 on the rear suspension and 2 on the rear anti-roll bar. Again, really soft approach. It will introduce some understeer, but that's natural. You're just going to have to brake a little bit earlier, but this will really help you kind of control the car through and out of the corner. And then ride height goes 7 and 6. Brakes, 95% brake pressure, 50% brake bias. This will help you prevent locking up a little bit more under braking. And then tyres are on 23.8 and 21.5. So 23.8 on both fronts and 21.5 on both rears. And this should give you a pretty tidy car setup for any wet race, no matter how unlikely it is to come. But I'm now going to move on to Australia, a track that actually could see some rain in real life and in career mode. We've finally reached a track that could see some rain in career mode and in real life. And that track is Australia, which has been heavily revised for F122. It's actually quite scary racing in the rain, that really fast sector in the middle. But starting with the aero, go with 19 on your front wing, 28 on your rear. You really want to get some rear stability, which is very hard to find in the rain. So increasing your rear wing aero a little bit more than your front is crucial here. And then for the transmission, again, I've gone 50%, 50%, the same as with Jeddah and Bahrain Setup, just to kind of give you the most traction you can get out of the slower corners. Suspension geometry, minus 2.6 and minus 1.3 on your camber, and then front toe of 0.06 and rear toe of 0.2. And for your suspension, this looks very similar to my last two setups for Bahrain and Jeddah as well. Go 3 on your front suspension, 4 on your front anti-roll bar, 1 on your rear suspension and 2 on your rear anti-roll bar. And then go 7 and 6 on your ride height. In fact, I think that is actually identical to the Jeddah setup. Then brakes, go 94% pressure, which is kind of where you're always going to be at with a wet setup. You're going to be somewhere between 93 and 96% brake pressure really. And then 50% brake bias. And then for your tyres, go 24.8 on your front right tyre, 24.5 on your front left, and then 22 and 21.8 on your rear tyres. Now, I've done this because the left-hand side of your car will take a lot more punishment than the right, so I've offset the tyre pressures a little bit to help sort of even the wear across your axles. But then I've also actually increased the tyre pressures over my dry setup because you have a much wider working window with the wet tyres than you do with the dry, so you can be a little bit more aggressive. And with higher tyre pressures, you will get heat into your tyres much better, which in F122 is crucial to getting grip from your tyres essentially. And that'll do it for our Australian wet race setup for F122. Back again with another wet race setup. And this one's for a track that has actually seen rain in the past few races, and that's Imola. I'm not going to waste any time, I'm going to jump straight into the setup, and you'll see that I've gone with an aero of 20 at the front and 28 at the rear. As with most wet setups, you want a little bit more downforce than your dry setup, and you do want to focus on the rear a little bit. Even though you're going to understeer in the rain, you still want to have good rear stability so you can actually try and get the power down a little bit easier, which is hard to do in the rain. Moving on to transmission, I've gone 50%, 50%. As I said, this is going to be the setup for pretty much every track in the rain. And then for suspension geometry, I've gone minus 2.7 front camber, minus 1.1 rear, and then 0.07 on the front toe, and then 0.2 on the rear toe. For the suspension, I've gone 4 at the front, 1 at the rear, and then 5 for your front ARBs and 1 at the rear again. And then a ride height of 6 at front and rear. That's not too high for a wet setup, but it's enough to stop you aquaplaning, especially if you get on the curbs. For the brakes, I've gone 95% brake pressure and 50% brake bias just to make braking a little bit easier in the rain. And then for the tyres, I've gone 24.3 on both fronts and 22.3 on both rears. As I mentioned in my previous setups, you can actually go higher with your tyre pressures in the rain than you can in the dry because it's a little bit harder to get heat in your tyres. But if you're racing with intermediates or on a drying track, you may want to take that into account and lower your tyre pressures a little bit. And that'll do it for our Imola wet race setup for F122. Next up, we're at Miami for our wet race setup for F122. And this is a very hard track to race in the rain. It's especially hard to get temperature into your tyres, especially with a really, really slow sequence in the middle of the lap. But let's kick things off with the aero, and we've gone 17 on your front wing and 21 on your rear. This should give you enough downforce while maintaining your top speed. And then for your transmission, I've gone 50%, 50% as always so far. Suspension geometry, I've gone minus 2.8 front camber, and then far right on the rear camber and far left on both front and rear toe. This approach is simply designed to give you as much traction as possible by straightening up your wheels and increasing your contact patch with the road. Then for the suspension itself, go with 3 at the front and 1 at the rear, and the anti-roll bars go 4 at the front and 3 at the rear, which is actually a bit stiffer than some of our previous setups at the rear anyway. And then for your ride height, go 5 at the front and 6 at the rear. For your brakes, go 94% pressure, 50% brake bias. So that's about just right for your brake pressure to stop you from locking up into some of the corners. And then for your tyre pressures, to combat the fact that it's incredibly hard to get temperature into your tyres in the rain around Miami, I have maxed out both front and rear tyres. So go 25.5 23.0 on your front tyres and 23.0 on your rears. And that will do it for this Miami wet race setup. Back with another wet setup for F122, and this time we're in Barcelona in Spain. And this setup felt really good. You could get the back of your car out a little bit, but it remained pretty much in control all the way through the lap. So I'm pretty happy with how this setup turned out. But starting with the aero, I've gone 31 on your front wing, 39 on the rear. This is probably quite a high downforce setup for Spain, but you do have enough straight line speed to stay competitive during the race. The transmission, 50%, 50%, as always with these wet setups so far. Suspension geometry, minus 2.7 front camber and then minus 1 rear, and then have a little bit of front toe with 0.06 and 0.2 at the rear. Then for your suspension, go 3 at the front, 2 at the rear, and then 4 and 3 on your anti-roll bars. You can see stiffening up the rear anti-roll bar and the rear suspension a little bit allows the car to kind of not oversteer, but the back end to be a little bit more playful, and you get a little bit more rotation in your car during a corner. Ride height goes 6 and 6. Then brakes go 94% pressure, 50% bias, which is about where they always are for most tracks. Just play about with the pressure a little bit, depending which track you're on. And then for your tyres, I've offset these because the left takes a bit more punishment than the right around this track. Go 24.0 on your front right, 23.8 on your front left, and then 22.0 and 21.8 on your rear pressures. As I mentioned, this setup may feel a little bit looser than some of the others, but it gives you good rotation into a corner. You won't understeer too much, allowing you to be pretty fast. There's only one thing worse than a race around Monaco, and that's a wet race around Monaco. This is a scenario which I hope you never have to encounter during your career mode or league racing in F122. But I'm going to jump straight into the setup and get this one over with pretty quickly. It did feel okay on track, but goddamn, Monaco's not a fun track to drive. So starting with the aero, go 50 and 50. You want as much downforce as you possibly can get around here, and transmission also 50-50, but 50%, 50% all the way left. With the suspension geometry, you want max camber front and rear, and then you want a little bit of front toe and no rear toe at all. So go 0.08 and 0.2 on your toe. For your suspension, you want it really soft. This track's extremely bumpy and it will throw your car about. So go with 2 on your front suspension, 1 on your rear, and then 3 on your front anti-roll bar and 2 on the rear. And then crank the ride height up to 7, just so you've got a bit of clearance. You won't aquaplane, you won't hit too many of the bumps. Brakes, you want 93% pressure, so you're not locking up too much because there are a lot of braking zones around here, and 50% brake bias. And then for your tyres, 24.0 on the fronts and 22.3 on your rears. Much like Monaco is horrible to drive in wet and dry, but especially in the wet, Baku is also pretty horrible to drive in the rain. It's a track that really doesn't suit wet weather. You have to be really slow through the middle sector, that castle sector, and then you're constantly losing the rear end through some of the faster corners. So it's a really tricky track to create a setup for, but here we go. For your aero, goes 13 at the front, 17 at the rear. You want to stay pretty low downforce because that's super long straight, but you need enough downforce to stop your car just wandering all over the road really. Transmission, go 50%, 50%. Suspension geometry, minus 2.8 at your front camber, minus 1 on the rear, and then minimum front and rear toe. Again, we just want as much sort of traction and grip as we can get really. Suspension, super soft, much like our Monaco setup, because Baku is pretty much a nightmare with bumps and curbs and things. Go 1 front suspension, 2 rear, and 1 front anti-roll bar and 3 on your rear. And then you'll want a pretty high ride height to stop yourself from aquaplaning. I found 7 and 8 was basically as low as I could go before I actually started just aquaplaning and sliding all over the track. Brakes, go 95% pressure, 50% bias. There are a few heavy stopping zones around Baku, so you want your brake pressure a little bit on the higher side for a wet setup. Then your tyres, again, it's hard to find tyre temperature around Baku, apart from your rear right tyre, which takes the most punishment. So you want max pressures everywhere else. Go 25.0 on both front tyres, and then 22.8 on your rear right and 23.0 on your rear left. It's no secret that I love the Canadian track in F1, in any F1 game really, but especially in F122. It's so fun to drive. And I think I may even enjoy driving in the rain more than in the dry. It's just extremely fun. Your car's always kind of on edge, especially through those really fast chicanes. But this setup seems to work really well. So go with your aero of 18 at the front, 21 at the rear. Then for your transmission, 50-50, as always so far. Suspension geometry, again, this follows suit of a lot of our wet setups. Go minus 2.8 in your front, minus 1 in your rear, and then far left on front and rear toe. Suspension, go 3 on your front suspension, 2 on the rear, 3 on your front anti-roll bar and 1 on the rear. You want a pretty soft car around Canada. Even though you're going to be leaning on your tyres and the car's going to be leaning to one side through a lot of these fast corners, you want to maintain a soft car. And then round out suspension setup with 7 on your front and rear ride height. For your brakes, you want pretty high brake pressure. There are a few big heavy stops into the hairpin and at the end of the really long straight into the chicane, so you've got 96% pressure, 50% bias. And then for your tyres, again, Canada's a track which is hard to heat your tyres up. And I think it's partially because you're going in a straight line for quite a significant amount of time, especially down that long straight and in between the chicanes. So your tyres get a chance to cool down. So go max pressures all round here, 25 on your fronts, 23 on your rears. And that'll do it for this Canadian wet setup. Back again with another wet setup for F122. And this time we're at Silverstone in Britain. This is easily one of my favourite tracks, wet or dry. It's just so fun to drive. But go with your aero, go pretty balanced with 20 at your front, 25 at the rear. And then transmission, 50%, 50%. Suspension geometry, go minus 2.6 on your front camber. And then we've changed it up a little bit. And I've actually gone further left on the rear camber than I normally do. Go minus 1.8. And then go 0.07 on your front toe and leave the rear toe at 0.2. That's crucial for pretty much any wet setup. Then for your suspension, go really soft around here. Go 3 on your front suspension and front anti-roll bar, and go 2 on your rear suspension and rear ARB. And then you actually want a pretty high ride height here. You want to be attacking quite a few curbs around here. And the last thing you want is to be hitting a curb and being pinged off track. So go 8 on your front ride height, and then 7 on your rear. For your brakes, go 95% pressure, 50% bias. And then for the tyre pressures, go 24.0 on both fronts. And then I've offset the rears. Go 22.5 on your right rear and 22.3 on your rear left, as that's the tyre that will take the most punishment and will heat up the most around a lap of Silverstone, wet or dry. Austria is incredibly fun to race, wet or dry, but it's equally good fun in the wet. Other than the really tricky and slow turn 3, and also turn 4 is incredibly hard. You just understeer due to the off camber, you'll just understeer out wide, and the gravel trap will literally suck you in. But let's jump into the setup. Go in aero, 21 at the front, 23 at the rear, and then your on-throttle diff actually keep it at 55%. Don't knock it down to 50% here, as there are so many fast corners. You'll benefit from a little bit sort of a locked setup, more so than normal anyway, and then 50% on your off-throttle diff as per normal. Suspension geometry, again, this follows suit of a lot of our setups. We almost want right, right, left, left, but with the front camber, keep it a little bit further away from max and go in minus 2.7. For your suspension, go 1 on your front suspension, 1 on your front anti-roll bar, really, really soft. And then I've kept this inverted setup that we did for our dry setup for Austria, but I've reduced it a little bit so it's not quite as stiff. Go 3 at your rear suspension and 4 on your rear anti-roll bar. And then for the ride height, go 6 on the front, 7 on the rear, get a little bit of rake in the car. For your brakes, 95% pressure, there are quite a few heavy stops around Austria. And then 50% bias, try to speak. And then for your tyres, go 24.3 on both fronts, 22.5 on both rears. Again, this is higher than our dry setup, but you just need these high pressures to increase your temperatures really, because tyre temperatures really suffer in the rain. France is another track that is actually surprisingly tricky to race in the rain. What makes it so hard is that there is very little track scenery, so finding your braking point is one of the hardest things to do around here. And in my French track guide, I actually talk about how hard it is to find reference points, because everything around this track is so flat and kind of grey, other than a little bit of blue and red, of course. But heading into the setup, go with 17 on your front wing aero and go 20 on the rear. Then for the transmission, 50%, 50%, as with a lot of our setups so far for the rain. Suspension geometry, again, probably one of my favourite setups to go to for a wet setup is minus 2.7 front camber, minus 1 rear, and then far left on the front toe and rear toe. For your suspension itself, go pretty soft all round. Go 3 at your front, 2 at the rear, and then 4 at your front anti-roll bar, and 2 on your rear ARB. And then a ride height of 7 and 7. Again, very similar to a lot of our wet setups. And then brake pressure, 95% and 50% brake bias. And for your tyre pressures, go 24.0 on both fronts and go higher on your rears, go 22.3 on both rears, just to get some temperature into them. And that will do it for this French wet setup video. And this is a track which I really enjoy racing. And racing in the rain as well is probably even more fun than in the dry. You can really balance your car, throwing it left and right, and there's always corners coming at you. But jumping into the setup, I've gone with an aero of 50 on front and rear wings. You want really high downforce here, similar to our Monaco setup. And then for the transmission, I've also gone 50 and 50 front, well not front and rear, go on throttle and off throttle, sorry. For your suspension geometry, go far right on your front camber, -2.5. Keep your rear camber pretty balanced at -1.5 because there are a lot of turns here. You'll always be going left and right, so maxing your rear camber out isn't always beneficial around Hungary. Then go far left on your front and rear toe. For your suspension, go pretty soft on your suspension anyway, go 3 at the front and 1 at the rear. And then I've gone a little bit stiffer on the anti-roll bars because we're always going to be turning. Go 5 on your front anti-roll bar and 3 on the rear. And then go the ride height of 8 on both front and rear. And you'll need that because there was a lot of kind of bumps, curbs, elevation change here. Brakes, I've lowered the pressure down to 93% because there are a lot of quick braking zones and you really don't want to snag a tyre because you'll end up in the grass. And then go 50% on your front brake bias. For your tyres, I've tailored these a lot. They're really offset just to kind of maintain the similar tyre temperature across all 4 tyres. Go 24.0 on your front right tyre, 23.8 on your front left, and then 22.3 on your right rear and 22 on your rear left tyre. I'm going to jump straight into the setup here. This setup felt really good. Go with an aero of 14 at the front and 16 at the rear. As with a lot of these setups, I've kind of kept the front and rear aero relatively balanced because you're going to suffer from understeer in the rain. Then for the transmission, go 55% on throttle, 51% off throttle. It's ever so slightly different to some of my other wet setups. But then suspension geometry, -2.5 front camber, that's pretty normal. -1.4 rear camber, it's a little bit further to the left than normal. And then on your toe, go far left, 0.05 and 0.2. For your suspension, go super soft on your suspension itself, 2 and 2, and then a little bit stiffer on your anti-roll bars, go 4 and 3. That'll help you maintain balance through a lot of these long, fast sweeping corners. For your ride height, go 7 and 7. There's a lot of elevation change here. You'll need that higher ride height just to allow you to climb over the curbs a little bit to minimize your corner angles. And then for your brakes, 96% pressure, which is pretty high for a wet setup, but there are some heavy braking zones here, 50% brake bias. Then for your tyres, relatively high again, as with most of our wet setups, go 24.3 on your fronts, 22.5 on your rears, and that should give you a pretty balanced setup for the very wet, heavy rain condition at Spa. Back again with another F122 wet setup, and this is for Zandvoort in the Netherlands, and this is a track that you really need to stay off the curbs for. They're pretty lethal in the dry, but in the wet, the combination of the big lumpy curbs and the rain just will throw you off track. So let's just jump straight into the setup itself and see what we've done to combat that. With your aero, go relatively high, go 32 on your front wing, 34 on your rear. And then for the transmission, go 50% on throttle, which is pretty normal. But then I've increased the off throttle diff up a little bit to 52%. For your suspension geometry, go -2.7 front camber and -1.1 rear camber, and 0.06 front toe, and then 0.2 rear toe. For your suspension, go really soft, like many of the wet setups I've done so far. 3 on your front suspension, 2 at the rear, and 3 on your front anti-roll bar and 3 on the rear. This will promote a little bit more oversteer, but this will allow you to really maximise your car's performance. Then for your ride height, go 7 and 7. For your brakes, go 95% pressure and 50% brake bias. And for your tyres, I've had to kind of create a really custom setup here just because your left tyres take a hell of a lot more punishment than your right tyres around Zandvoort. For your front right, go 24.0, front left, go 23.8. And then for your rear right, go 22.3, and then whack your rear left really far down to 21.8. And even though this setup goes away from some of the norms of our wet setups so far, it produces a really drivable car around a really tricky track. Back again, and we're at a track which has seen some pretty wild wet races in the past, and that track's Monza in Italy. And this was the scene of Seb Vettel's first win in a Toro Rosso in the rain. So it's got some pretty good memories for me. But starting with the aero for this setup, go 6 at the front and 7 at the rear. Even though you're going to be racing in the rain, you still want a super low downforce setup. Otherwise you can get blown away by the AI on the straights. Then for the transmission, go 50%, 50%. For your suspension geometry, go -2.5 and -1, and then 0.05 and 0.2 on your toe. This is pretty standardized for our wet setups, especially ones which have incredibly high top speed tracks. Then for your suspension, go 3 and 2 on both front suspension and rear suspension, and 3 and 2 again on your front and rear ARBs. Then for your ride height, go a little bit higher at the front, go 7 and then 6 at the rear. And for your brakes, you want pretty high brake pressure at 97% because you're going to be stopping from pretty incredible speeds. And then for your brake bias, go 50% as with most of our setups. Then for your tyres, you want to go pretty high. The really long straights here will allow your tyres to cool down very fast, so you want high pressures to keep the temperature in your tyres. Go max tyre pressures on your front, and then 22.8 on your rear right, and 22.5 on your rear left pressure. And that'll do it for this Italian wet race setup video for F1 22. I'm here with another wet race setup video for F1 22, and we're at Singapore, which can get pretty crazy in the rain. A combination of the spray coming off the cars and the lights, because you're racing at night, it just makes it visibility incredibly hard. But here is our car setup anyway. It is really stable and really fun to drive this track. So starting with the aero, I've maxed out our front and rear wing to 50. Much like our Monaco setup, Singapore just requires max downforce to be fast. Then for the transmission, again you want really low on throttle diff. You're going to be accelerating from extremely slow speeds quite often, and 50% as well on the off throttle. Suspension geometry is pretty much a right, left setup, but with the front toe I've gone 0.06 rather than minimising it. And then with the suspension, go pretty soft, go 2 and 2 on your front and rear suspension, and then 4 and 2 on your anti-roll bars. And then for your ride height, go 7 and 7 like I've used for a lot of our wet setups so far. For the brakes, 93% pressure will stop you locking up as much, especially when you're braking, kind of just dabbing the brakes through some of the fast and medium speed corners, and then 50% brake bias. And finally, your tyre pressures need really kind of individualising because the right tyres get worn a lot faster, so you want lower pressures there to keep the temperatures down a little bit. So go with 24.5 and 24.8 on your front tyres, and 22.3 and 22.5 on your rear tyres, just to help keep things balanced. And that'll do it for this Singapore wet race setup video for F1 22. Back again with another wet race setup video for F1 22, and this is for Suzuka in Japan. And this is an incredibly fun track. It reminds me of Canada a little bit. It's just kind of an old school track, which is incredibly fun and flowing, and especially enjoyable to race in the rain. Let's jump straight into the setup. With the aero, I've gone 32 and 33, which is pretty much as balanced as we've been with any of our setups so far. You really want an equally good front and rear car here, just to keep the balance perfectly neutral. And then for the transmission, go 50% on throttle and 52% off throttle. For your suspension geometry, I haven't maxed out the front camber here. Instead, I've gone -2.9. And for the rear camber, I have maxed it out, go -1, then 0.06 on your front toe, and then far left at 0.2 on the rear, just like most of our wet setups. For your suspension, go 3 and 2 on your suspension, and then 5 and 3 on your anti-roll bar. This will just help keep some stability through the really long sweeping corners. And then for the ride height, go with my favourite setup in the rain of 7 and 7. For your brakes, go 94% pressure, 50% brake bias, which is pretty normal for our wet setups. And then for your tyres, you don't need to go as high as some tracks in the rain. Instead, go kind of medium to high, go 24.0 on your fronts and 22.3 on the rears. And that rounds out our Japanese setup for the rain in F1 22. As with all of our wet setups so far, this is for the really heavy rain condition. This isn't for light rain or intermediate tyres. Here we are with another setup video for F1 22, and this is the wet setup for Kota in the USA. And I love this track normally, but in the rain, God, it's hard to drive. You get so much understeer through that kind of middle to last sector. It's a tricky beast. But let's jump into the setup. And with the aero, I've gone 21 at the front, 24 at the rear. I would like more front wing aero here just to get a little bit more turn in, but you really suffer in straight line speed and your balance overall. On the transmission, go 50%, 50%. Suspension geometry, you want pretty much right, right, left, left. Go -2.5 and -1.1 on your camber, and then far left on your front and rear toe. For your suspension, go 3 at the front, 2 at the rear, and then 5 and 3 on your anti-roll bars. I did play around with flipping this and going with stiffer anti-roll bars, stiffer rear suspension to get a little bit more rotation, but it made the rear of the car incredibly unstable. And I think time trial setups will probably go that way, but for a long race distance in the rain, it's incredibly hard to drive. For your ride height, go 7 and 7, and then for the brakes, go 93% pressure and 50% bias. There are some heavy stops, so you would really want higher brake pressure, but there are also quite a few areas, especially in the middle to last sector, where you're rotating the car and braking at the same time, so you want a little bit lower pressure just to avoid a lockup. And then for your tyres, I've gone super even, so go 24.3 on your fronts, 22.3 on the rears. And that'll do it for this COTA wet race setup. Let me know if you struggle as much as I do around this track in the rain. As I said, in the dry it's really, really good fun, but in the rain not so much. So guys, I've got another wet setup video for you here, and we're coming into the last few tracks on the calendar. And much like our previous setup at COTA, this Mexican circuit is super tricky in the rain. It's not the most enjoyable. But let's jump into the setup anyway, and I'm pretty happy with this setup. It creates a pretty balanced car, pretty drivable. So with the aero, go 14 and 16, and then with the transmission, go 50-50, just like normal. Then for your suspension geometry, again, right, right, left, left, pretty standardized. Suspension, really soft, with a little bit of stiffness at the rear just to get a bit of rotation. Go 3 and 2 on your suspension and 4 and 3 on your anti-roll bars. And then my favourite ride height setting of 7 and 7. Brakes, go 94% pressure, 50% bias, gives you pretty good braking performance. And then for your tyres, I've gone 24.5 on both fronts, and then I've mixed up the rears, go 22.8 on your rear right and 22.5 on your rear left. It's just that your rear left takes a little bit more punishment and needs a little bit more care. And that will do it for this Mexican wet race setup video. For this setup, we're at Brazil, and this is incredibly fun to race in the rain, this track. It's one of my absolute favourites on the calendar, wet or dry, and this setup was just super fun to create, and I'm pretty happy with the turnout. So with the aero, go 14 and 16, go pretty balanced. Again, you'll want good front end, good rear stability as well. And then for the transmission, 50%, 50%, much like most of our setups in this wet series. Then for your suspension geometry, again, similar to a lot of our setups, right, right, left, left. Suspension itself, I've gone pretty soft on the rears here. Normally I keep a little bit of stiffness in the anti-roll bar, but I've lowered it right down here. So go 3 and 2 on your suspension and 4 and 1 on your anti-roll bar. And then run your ride height a little bit less than some tracks, go 6 and 6. For your brakes, I've lowered the pressure to 93% to avoid lockups into some of those kind of off-camber corners or those corners in the middle sector where you're slightly turning and rotating the car when braking. And then go 50% brake bias like normal. And then I've had some fun with the tyre pressures here, creating a little pattern. Go 23.5 on your front right and 24.0 on your front left. Then go 21.8 and 22.3 on your rear pressures. Of course, there is method to this madness. Your rear takes a lot of punishment, so it needs to be pretty much quite a lot lower than your left tyre pressures here to keep temperatures in check. This setup was probably the one I spent the most amount of time creating, as this track is incredibly tricky, especially in the rain, even though it's a track that's probably never going to see rain in the regular season or in a career mode. But here we go anyway. With the aero, I've kept things really, really balanced. I've gone 22 on the front and 23 on the rear, just to give you really good front end, more so than focusing on the rear stability. But that's also important. Your transmission, 50%, 50% like normal. Suspension geometry, right, right, left, left, again like normal. And then for the suspension, I've gone 3 and 2 on your suspension. I've gone really stiff, well not really stiff, but stiff for a wet setup on the anti-roll bars. Go 4 and 4. And if you ride height, go slightly higher at the front, go 7 and 6. That will allow you to attack some of the curves a bit better. Then for your brakes, I've got 96%, which is a little bit on the high side for a wet setup. It'll give you good stopping power at the end of those 2 long straights, and then 50% on your bias. And then for your tyres, 24.0 on your front right and 24.3 on your front left, and then 22.0 on your rear right and 22.5 on your rear left. And that will do it for all of the tracks on the F1 calendar in F1 22. I'm back with another setup for F1 22, and this is for the much requested wet setup for Portugal. A lot of you guys have been requesting it, and rightfully so. It's the last track on the calendar which I haven't created a wet setup for. So let's jump straight in and have a look at this one. Starting with the aero, I've gone with 22 on the front wing and 32 on the rear. I've seen a lot of time trial setups running super high front and rear wings, but running that in a race, you're just going to get punished down the straights. So you have to go kind of pretty balanced on your wing setup. Having a rear wing of 32 will help keep the rear planted. There are so many long sweeping corners and undulations that you need the rear of your car planted into the ground. And then for the transmission setup, go with 50-50 on both on and off throttle diff. This is the same as pretty much every wet setup we've created. For your suspension geometry, go right, right, left, left. Almost as if it had been ripped out of a time trial setup, but you don't need to worry too much about tyre wear during the rain around Portugal, so this is the best way to go. Then for the suspension, I've gone pretty firm on our front suspension and front anti-roll bar, and this was to keep the car planted into the ground. If you soften your front suspension too much, the rear of your car had a tendency to give way under high load, so run pretty stiff here. So go 9 and 1 on your front and then rear suspension, and then 10 and 1 on your anti-roll bars. And then bump up the ride height a little bit to 6 and 7, just to ensure you don't aquaplane. Then for your brakes, go 94% pressure, 50% brake bias. The lower pressure just helps kind of avoid locking up a little bit. And then for your tyre pressures, go 24.0 on your front right, 23.8 on your front left, and then 22.5 on both rear tyres. These pressures have been optimised so that during a race you won't overheat your tyres, and you also won't suffer from a lack of heat as well. Yo guys, I'm here again with another setup, and this one's for the newly released China track. I have already dropped the dry setup, but now I'm going to attempt China in the wet, which is fun. I really enjoy this track even in the rain. You just have to be a little bit careful on your rear end, which can get away from you at certain points. But let's jump straight into the aero setup and see how we combat this and see how we make the car really stable. So I've gone with a front wing aero of 23 and a rear wing aero of 27. So I boosted both of these up a little bit from our dry setup, but I've boosted the rear wing a little bit more just to give a little bit of extra rear stability. And then it's no surprise you want to go 50-50 on the transmission. You want as little wheel spin as you can get, so go on throttle of 50, and then for some extra rotation at slower speeds, it helped with the understeer a little bit, go 50 on your off throttle diff. Next up, the suspension geometry, and this is unchanged from our dry setup. Go right, right, left, left. It's the best way really. And then for the suspension, I've softened the front suspension a little bit, bring that down to 2 and then 1 on your rear suspension, and then the anti-roll bars go 3 and 1. Now I've increased the rear ride height to match the front, so go 10 and 10 on your ride height, which should be just about right. It'll give you more than enough clearance over the wet track surface, and as long as you aren't attacking curbs too crazily, this will be absolutely fine. And for the brakes, I've reduced the pressure down to 95%. This will help avoid lockups when braking too heavily, but you do still want quite a lot of brake pressure because of that really big stop at the end of the back straight. And then for the brake bias, go 50% as per normal. For your tyres, I've increased pressures all round, which has kind of been the way with F122. You need to increase the pressures in the wet to get some more temperature in, otherwise the tyres just don't work at all. So go 23.0 psi on both front tyres, and then 21.8 on your rear right and 21.5 on your rear left tyre. And that'll do it for our wet Chinese F122 setup. Let me know in the comments below how you get on with this setup and whether you're liking this new track that's been added. And do you think Codemasters and EA should add even more new tracks to the game? But also, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more daily sim racing and F122 content. And I will see you on track, guys.